This is tape 2, side A, and you were talking about the basketball team, which leads me to this question. I have heard several of the members of Company B talk about what might be called the spirit of Company B, and they think it was a very unusual company. What do you think of it?
I agree. We were unusual. No modesty at all. I'm going to say we were unusual. We were a bright group of young men. We had a nice cross-section of Emporia people. Not all of us were perfect citizens, but when we went to Robinson, I think we were sort of determined that we would try to do our best, and we excelled in a number of ways. If you were to go back and look at the Santa Fe Trail, which was the division newspaper that was published once a week, you would see many, many, many articles about Company B and the company's accomplishments. On the rifle range, people being selected to serve as honor guards. There were two McCreary brothers, Walt and another McCreary that I can't remember. And those two were spit and polished soldiers, and they were selected any number of times to be honor guards for funerals and that sort of thing. We did a lot of activity that was above and beyond the call, and we established ourselves as really, I'm sure other units had this same feeling, but Company B certainly had it, and that is that we were a superior unit and we were able to make a contribution that was above and beyond the normal. We didn't have a lot of goof-offs. Now, this is not to say that there weren't incidents of which somebody in the unit wasn't particularly proud. There were times when there were troubles. There were a lot of young drinkers in the group who became young drinkers, and intoxication from time to time was a problem. Everything did not run smoothly all the time. The first sergeant, Vernon Fenner, was a pretty tough taskmaster, and a lot of the personnel did not get along well with the first sergeant, which, by the way, is nothing unusual. A lot of soldiers don't get along with first sergeants, but there was friction from time to time, of course, and you'd expect that in a group of men of that age, in that kind of an experience. But overall, the spree of Company B was something that I learned from that unit and took with me throughout my professional career.
Another question along the same line. Did you know John Cooper?
Not well.
Because of course, it's his death that led to Veterans Day.
John was not. I was in the first platoon, and it's amazing how. Start to use the word segregated. That's not the right word. It's amazing how isolated we were,
yes,
platoon to platoon. John was either in the second or third platoon. Of course, I knew him. We knew everybody in the unit. Everybody knew everybody else in the unit.
But you didn't know him well.
But I didn't know him well. I didn't know well enough to talk about John in any way, shape, or form.
I was surprised to learn when we have pictures in which Tom Tholen says on the back, he lists who's in the picture, John Cooper, and I've shown it to 3 or 4 of the vets, and nobody can pick him out.
Right.
They can't tell which one is him.
I doubt if I could.
Yeah.
I really doubt if I could.
Okay.
By the way, you mentioned Tholen. Tom and I were tent mates. I was a sergeant. He was in my squad, and Tom and I spent a year at Camp Robinson living in the same tent along with 6 other, I've waffled on this, but I finally decided there were 8 people in that tent, not 6. Mm-hmm. And Tom and I were 2 of them.
I take it, and I believe you've been pretty closely connected with Tholens over the years since that time.
Yes, that was a friendship that we established and never relinquished. Yeah, mm-hmm. Tom stayed here in Emporia all of his life, and I roamed all over the country, but we always kept in touch. We traveled together on some overseas trips, and when Edie, my wife and I, Edith, come back to Emporia, we always saw the Tholins, and I still see Tom's wife Betty when we come back here. I forgot to mention, and maybe you can insert this someplace else. I got married in this. No, that's later. I'm sorry.
Later. I was going to say.
I'm jumping ahead.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
I don't have a sneezing spell coming on here.
Got all
Well, we'll leave it in and hope for the best. One of the big things that happened at Camp Robinson in '41, and I believe you've mentioned this briefly now, were the famous Louisiana Maneuvers. Would you care to comment on that?
Yes, that was the big. That was a big part of the year's training. The maneuver started, I think, in July. I'm not sure how long they lasted, 6 or 8 weeks. We left Camp Robinson sometime in the summer and headed into South Arkansas by trucks. And I can't identify many geographical locations in Arkansas, but after that first night of movement out of the area around Little Rock, we were on our own, on our feet. And the company and many other companies covered a whole lot of South Arkansas real estate. We walked, and it was tough. It was hot, it was windy, it was dusty, it was dirty, and we were out in the field, but we understood. By this time, we were in good physical shape. If we hadn't been in good physical shape when we got to Robinson, by the time the maneuver started, because of the basic training and all the other things, the obstacle courses and all the rest of it, and the running and everything else, we were in good physical shape.
In other words, what you're telling me, in spite of the fact that the training even there was pretty rudimentary, it did get you guys in shape.
Exactly. So we were hardened to the point where when they began to put the pressure on, and they did. I mean, we did a lot of full pack with rifle walking through southern Arkansas.
It was a test.
It was a test. The purpose of that maneuver really was not so much to find out what the individual soldier could do. The purpose of that maneuver was to find out whether or not the doctrine, the new military doctrine of tank warfare and maneuver warfare, rather than trench warfare, was going to function.
Interesting point, because of course George Patton and Dwight Eisenhower were both in on that maneuver.
Exactly, they were. And by that time, there were actually tanks that had been produced.
For which Patton bought gas when he needed at local gas stations.
I didn't know that, but I'm not surprised. I was just going to say not very many tanks, and not the type of tank that actually would have been effective in a warfare situation. But again, we were arming up and not only training personnel, but we were equipping. I think that was one of the significant things as the war economy began to shape up. And as I said, we got vehicles in the infantry units. Tanks came along, trucks came along, prime movers came along. All of this equipment began to flood in, and you actually realized you were part of a big military machine. But these maneuvers for the individual soldier were just a pain. You didn't know what was going on. One of the problems in the military always is to keep people informed, and the Army did not do a good job of that, getting the word down to the company commanders and the platoon commanders so they could tell their individual soldiers what was happening. You never knew what was happening. You just knew you were out there milling around with a red or a blue armband on. They had made up names for the two elements, but you were just a cog in a greater wheel, and the whole effort was directed at testing this new doctrine of armored warfare and maneuverability, as opposed to the trench warfare of World War II.
World War I, you mean?
I'm sorry, World War I, right? Of World War I, where people rose and went out of the trenches across no man's land. I gather, however, that those maneuvers were effective. For us, it was mosquito bites and snakes and rain. A lot of us bought hammocks, which were not government issue, but the snakes in Arkansas and Louisiana were bad. And to get away from snakes on the ground, a lot of us bought hammocks and would hang them between a lot of pine trees down there. We moved around Louisiana and on these maneuvers, never being quite sure where we were or what we were going to do. I remember we had a couple of days exercise where we were all put in backs of trucks, and these trucks kept moving back and forth over the same route. I never did figure out what that was all about, but for about 2 days, with some stops for meals and pit stops and that sort of thing, but apparently it was some kind of a motorized patrol or something, but the word never filtered down to the troops as to why we're doing this and what we are doing or why we're doing it. And that's very important to a soldier.
The point you bring up is really interesting to me, because one of the things that was brought up, and I can't remember which one did, who it was in this series of interviews, somebody said the real thing about the Army, as compared to today, is the lack of communication all the way through. You never knew what almost the fellow a mile down the road was doing.
Closer than that, Loren. I would say sometimes 50 to 100 yards away, you didn't know.
You didn't have this instant communication back and forth that you have today.
No, we had radios, but they were very ineffective. We did have, that was another piece of equipment that we picked up. Never had any radios back in the early days before we were mobilized. Radios came along, that type of communication came along, but they were not effective, but at least we were moving in the right direction.
This fellow said you had to communicate by messenger.
Right, oh yes.
Yeah, send somebody to headquarters, or they send somebody out.
Oh, absolutely. Every company commander had a runner.
Yeah.
And platoon leaders. In your platoon, you had somebody designated as a runner. And you had message books, and a little, maybe kind of 3x5 type book, and with lines on a form and a line for the date and that sort of thing. You would scribble out messages on those and run them from one platoon to another. And you had a lot of hand and arm signals, so that if you had visual contact, the Army had a whole system of hand and arm signals telling you what to do. Pretty primitive stuff compared to what is going on now.
Well, the maneuvers, of course, were the big thing, and we've gone into it several times. I don't really think we go into it in detail. Is this the one where General Ben Lear got into trouble?
It was, yes.
See, I've kind of wondered about that, because the troops were apparently coming back from Memphis, Tennessee when this happened.
That's correct. This is an interesting story, and I saved a whole set of newspaper clippings, which I think are in the Lyon County Historical Society library. What happened was, as the maneuvers ended, the troops began to return to Camp Robinson. Maneuvers were probably over in August, sometime before Labor Day. A quartermaster unit, quartermaster being troops that provide supplies, was riding in trucks from Memphis to Little Rock, and they passed a golf course. And on the golf course were some women playing golf wearing shorts. Soldiers in the trucks saw the women and yelled out at them and whistled, and somebody ostensibly yelled, "Yoo-hoo," among other things at these young women. Fortunately or unfortunately, General Ben Lear, who was the commanding officer of an Army group, and I'm not sure which one, Ben Lear was on the golf course. He saw and heard this exchange, sort of one-way exchange from the soldiers to the young ladies on the golf course, and he took offense at that. He traced down, he had his staff trace down and find out who the people were in those trucks, and he ordered them to come back to Memphis and to walk from Memphis to Little Rock. They were to walk from Memphis to Little Rock. That was the order. And this, of course, as you can imagine, got a lot of press. It got a lot of press. And the pro and con reaction of the public was unbelievable, and most of the people were on the side, most of the public reaction was on the side of the soldiers. But the quartermaster troops started the march. They never made the march all the way from Memphis to Little Rock. They did some punitive marching for a period of time, and then they were picked up and trucked in. But that was a big fiasco. I'd forgotten about that, but yes, that was a big thing. Anticlimactic ending to the maneuvers. I think the maneuvers probably went well for the commanders. As I understand it, they learned a lot and got a lot done.
Certainly General Eisenhower made his reputation.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Eisenhower did.
Though he was not the nobody that he sometimes pictured before that.
No. He was somebody. Yeah. Even then. I don't know what his rank was. Probably Lieutenant Colonel at that time. I'm not sure.
Yes.
And but no, he made a mark. Those maneuvers were, I think, a significant part in the development of the forces for World War II. We got back to Robinson, and I honestly don't remember much about it. No, we all got leave. I had gotten a leave in the spring to come back to Emporia for a week after we finished basic training, and incidentally, to jump around a little bit, I was back home about the time that Germany invaded Russia, and
this is the summer of 1941.
Right, and I remember that happening while I was here in Emporia, home on leave. But when we got back to Robinson after maneuvers, we didn't just sit around, but there was no intensity to what we were doing. We were sort of marking time. I honestly can't remember much of what we did after we came back from maneuvers.
So do you remember when you did, in effect, learned that you weren't going to get out in the year?
Sure. It happened in this way. I learned it abruptly, and I learned it on the 7th of December, 1941.
Well, did you know it before that?
No.
You didn't know it before the 7th of December?
Didn't really know it. Here, let me say that my whole focus, and I think the focus of a whole lot of other people, was to get that year and get back and get on with our civilian life. So I think we were in a hope mode, that we were hoping that this would happen. Now, we knew the war was raging on, but the commitment that we'd made was for a year. And we had done our year almost, and we thought that
you even up to December 7th, you figured you were going to get out?
I thought the chances were pretty good that we were going to get out. Yes, I did. Now, interestingly enough, I have no concept as to what was happening in these divisions that had been mobilized earlier in the war and had completed their year's training in, say, September or October. There was a huge cry.
You were a late goer in.
Yeah, we were late going in, and I don't have in my memory bank anything about
whether they got out or
not. There was a great cry, Ohio, O-H-I-O, over the hill in October. The cry being, if we don't get out,
we'll walk away.
In October, we're leaving.
Yeah.
Ohio, and but I honestly don't know in my own mind, Loren, what happened to those other units. I guess looking back on it now, they probably weren't demobilized. But I had blinders on as far as that was concerned. I was thinking about myself and about Company B, and I don't recollect us talking about it. I just assumed that when that year was up, something was going to happen. That was naive, because I saw absolutely no indication of people, okay, start turning in supplies, start doing anything to break this down. Yeah, that we're going to demobilize. But in my little head, I had the concept that we were going to go home.
But December 7th came along, Pearl Harbor Day.
On Sunday, December the 7th, a group of us realized we had spent that year in Little Rock, and we'd never been to Memphis, Tennessee. Somebody had a car. I don't remember who it was, but the Tholen brothers, Tom and Jerry Tholen, a fellow named Dick McAdam from Kingman, who was a student here in Company B, and I think there was one other. I think there were 5 of us. We decided, after the Tholens went to Mass, they always went to Mass on Sunday, and I didn't go to Protestant services. Should have, but didn't. Anyway, we decided to drive late morning to drive to Memphis and just take a look at Memphis, and then drive back that evening. We didn't have a radio in the car, but we took off and drove over, and we drove to what I think is now an interesting and famous hotel, the Peabody Hotel. The Peabody is the hotel where they have the ducks on the roof of the hotel. They bring them down on the elevator. They roll out a red carpet between the elevator and a water fountain in the middle of the lobby, and the ducks parade in and get into the fountain and spend the day there, and then in the evening they cart them back up and go. The Peabody was a big hotel at that time. It later went into disrepair and was closed, and then years later they remodeled it and re-upped it, and it's now a first-rate hotel. I went to a military reunion there one time. Very, very nice facilities. At any rate, we went to the Peabody Hotel, and we're milling around a small gift shop or coffee shop or some sort of thing, looking for postcards and probably cigarettes, because we all smoked like crazy then, and maybe a trinket or two. And the clerk at the gift shop counter said to us, "Did you know that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor?" She was the first person. This probably was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And of course we didn't know. So that was the word. Well, immediately hearing that, we hopped back into the car and headed back to Camp Robinson. And I'm vague on the precise timing of this, but it doesn't make any difference. But as we drove back, it was dark. But as we crossed the Mississippi River from Memphis to North Memphis on the Arkansas side, there were already guards on that bridge. I don't know where these guards came from, but there were guards on that bridge. And we had no radio, as I said, so we would stop along the way at various and sundry points, and we would go into a restaurant, and people were clustered around the radio listening. We finally got back to Robinson, and it was pure chaos at Robinson. All the lights were on, people were flooding back in from the weekend. The guard stations at the entrances were jammed with cars and people and so forth and so on. And that was when, Loren, I knew for sure I wasn't going back to Emporia on the 23rd of December to get back to KSTC.
Oh, you're going to go to the West Coast.
That decision was made. I've never been totally clear or understanding why we were picked to go to the West Coast, but we were. One rumor that floated around is we were headed for the Philippines, to go out to the Philippines, because the Japanese, when they attacked Pearl Harbor, had also attacked in the Philippines. I don't know where we were headed, but we went to the West Coast. They moved the whole division out. I can't remember the exact dates, but we went on a troop train, and
At least you were there by Christmas.
we were there by Christmas. We arrived in at Fort Ord, California. After
Well,
a train.
before we arrived, tell me about the trip.
Oh, the trip was for most people it was just another train trip, but for me, because of just a unique situation that happened, as they got the rolling stock ready for this troop train, they were sort of reaching into the reserve, and we happened to be assigned to a railroad car that must have been one of the most ancient that they could put out on the track. It still had gas lights in this one particular car. Now, fore and aft of us, we were not in Pullmans, we were in coach cars, but fore and aft of us, there were modern cars. Our car was this antiquated car with the gas lights, which didn't work. And our first stop from after leaving Little Rock was Kansas City. And we had gone that first night without any lights at all in the car, which was manageable getting across the country. So the electricians came into the car. They let us off at Kansas City, walked us around the Liberty Memorial to let us get a little exercise. And when we came back, the electricians had strung a power line through the car, as I remember, with about 3 bare bulb lights on it, so that we did have light. You couldn't turn those lights on or off. They stayed on all the time, day or night, because they were hooked up to the generating system in the train. And so we rode out. It was miserable. The seats were miserable. The accommodations, the toilet accommodations were unsatisfactory, and we would slip back into the car behind us or the back ahead of us to shave and use the bathroom facilities. And of course the troops back there didn't like it very much, but we were living in this really terribly old car. I would love to know what happened to that car. But we made it to the West Coast, and we would stop along the way and exercise. We ate our meals on the train. They had mess cars on the train, and we ate satisfactorily, and we didn't have enough exercise. But we got to Fort Ord, California, and we disembarked, and that would have been probably 3 or 4 or 5 days before Christmas, probably less than a week before Christmas. And we were put into barracks there, adequate barracks. Fort Ord is a big post, had a lot of room, a lot of space, good military post, permanent military post at that time. No tents, we were in regular barracks, so forth and so on, went well. And Christmas came along, and the order came down, everybody get ready to move to the field. Why? We were asking ourselves, again, not having good flow of information. Don't ask, just get ready to move to the field. So we did on the 24th of December. What they did was they dispersed us. Officers, the command was very uneasy about the fact that they didn't know where the Japanese were. There were all sorts of concerns about possible attacks along the West Coast. And so,
of course, they'd had an experience at Pearl Harbor where they had moved planes and stuff into close things that made them subject to easy attack.
Exactly right, and that's one of the things you always want to do in the military is spread out. I mean, lessen that target availability and opportunity. I still see soldiers today that I think, and vehicles in Iraq that I think are moving too close together. Embedded in my mind as a soldier is spread out. Don't let one shell get you all. And that's what they were doing with this exercise. Mm-hmm. And so we were out in the field. We ate out of mess kits in the field. And then on the 26th, we came back in. We did the same thing on New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, out into the field again, and sleeping in pup tents. Cold, pretty damp. I don't really remember too much about the weather, but it was not particularly pleasant. I know that.
What were you doing at Fort Ord?
We didn't do anything except we were there for such a short period of time, and they told us we would be moving, and we just sort of got in there and got organized and got structured into the barracks and got set up. but we were there such a few days that there was no particular activity. We were going to the motion picture theater to see movies. We were going to the canteen. We were going to the PX. We didn't do any particular training, with one exception. We had some field exercises, and I do remember this, going away from Ord down through the sand dunes and the beaches on a night problem. And it was a total mess. At that time, a captain, Harry Parker, who had been an original member of Company B, and Harry had been enlisted, had gotten his commission, and by this time I'm pretty sure he was a captain. And Harry was the company commander. Tommy O'Connell had moved on to battalion by that time. Again, a lot of shifting of officers in those early days. Harry is leading the company. We are out in those sand dunes at night. Nobody knows what is going on at all. Doesn't have the slightest idea. People cursing, running around in the dark, total confusion. What the purpose of that was, I have no idea. But that's the only recollection I have of going into the field, with the exception of the dispersal activity that I.
This is tape 2, side B. And Bob, after Fort Ord, you of course moved to the Presidio of San Francisco.
Right. We went up by trucks in early January, 4 or 5 days after the start of the year. We moved by trucks up to the Presidio. First night we moved into an airplane hangar down on Christie Field, which is right, it's a short landing strip for light aircraft right down on the water, close to the Golden Gate Bridge, and spent the first night there. Then the next day we moved up onto the main post, and we were housed in a series of old, marvelously old, wonderful brick Army barracks, row after row after row of them, on the parade ground and near the guardhouse and near the center of the Presidio. And Company B was assigned to be the guard company at the Presidio of San Francisco. And I happen to think that wasn't by coincidence. I think that was because at Camp Robinson we demonstrated that we had some capabilities to do things right and to do things well, and we got that really rather plum assignment at the Presidio because we could perform.
And that was a job that was essentially meeting the public all the time.
That's right. We were in the public eye all the time. We were guarding the hospital. We were guarding the telephone exchange. We were in the guardhouse. We were at entry points. We had a guard post on one of the approaches to the Golden Gate Bridge, not on the bridge itself, but to one of the approaches that ran through the Presidio and was elevated, and they were concerned about people throwing incendiaries or bombs or whatever over on from the overpass. We had a whole set of Army posts, and we were on guard duty. Guard duty contains 3 shifts. You have a sergeant of the guard and an officer of the day, and you have a provost marshal. In this case, it was a Major Steele, Steele. He was regular Army. He was not part of the 35th Division at all. But our officer of the day was one of the company officers, and then sergeants such as myself were sergeants of the guard on a rotating basis. And we changed the guard every day at noon. We would march down to the parade ground, and from the barracks to the parade ground, and go through the exercise of the old guard company coming off duty and the new guard company coming on. The band would be there. I think it was, I'm not sure where the band, from whence it came. It wasn't a 35th Division band. It was another band there on the post. And they would come and march us through that exercise. We also had the responsibility for raising and lowering the flag, but the big responsibility was being the guard unit for the post itself. The waterworks, they thought, was one of the crucial elements on the post. And I don't know how many dry runs we did on the waterworks. It was high up on a mountaintop. We ran up and down that ice plant out there. Ice plant is a particular ground cover type of plant in California. We ran up and down that slippery slope, I don't know how many times, in dry runs to protect the water supply.
Now, I had the impression from talking to you that you considered the time in San Francisco really, if you had to pick a fun time, that would be it.
That would be my fun time. Now, you're right. Little Rock, not my fun time. San Francisco, fun time. And the reason was, as I said, we were on duty for 24 hours, then we were off for 24 hours. So that off day, we didn't have any responsibility except to get ready for the next day that we were going to go on duty. That meant we could spend a lot of time in the city of San Francisco, and a lot of us did. And we did a lot of growing up there. San Francisco is still one of my favorite cities in the United States, although the culture has changed markedly since the days we were there. What was interesting about it was that town was teeming with military people, and the Army commander in the area had ordered that no Army military could drink liquor, could order a drink or a beer. The Navy and the Marines had no such restrictions. So when you went into town, and if you went into a bar and you wanted to have a drink, you had to ask somebody from the Navy or the Marine Corps to order it for you and buy it and then slip it over to you. It was ridiculous. It really was. But one thing that was serious about the Presidio were the blackouts of San Francisco. We had 3 blackouts that I can remember, 3 dry runs on blackouts. They weren't caused by any indication of an attack. They were preparatory and training exercises to see if they could black out the city. And that's quite an experience to see the lights go out in San Francisco. And I saw that 3 times. And one night I was on duty in the guardhouse. And when the blackout was called, that phone began to ring off the wall of people reporting in, there's a light at such and such a place, there's a light at such and such a place. It was a very unsteady time on the West Coast. Nobody was sure of what was going to happen. Unfortunately, that duty in San Francisco ended along in probably in about March. We went from January to about March. And the company was moved for reasons that, again, I have no idea. We went to Benicia Arsenal. Benicia, B-E-N-I-C-I-A, is a small town, and it had an Army arsenal there, but it was also the railhead for all the ammunition that was being produced and shipped to the Pacific Theater. And so our duty at Benicia was to guard not the civilian population, not these pleasant positions that we'd had at the Presidio, to guard boxcars filled with ammunition. It was absolutely the most boring duty I've ever experienced in the Army. Nobody took that very seriously because if somebody had decided they wanted to blow that up, I don't think there was any way that we could have stopped them. By the way, later on during the war, black troops who were loading ammunition onto ships in that Suisun Bay area rebelled after an explosion. But the other part of my story is that while I was at the Presidio, I was called before a board of officers to be interviewed for officers candidate school.
Let me interrupt you right there. At this time, there is kind of, what shall I call it, a rush movement out of Company B, of the original members doing various things, what do you attribute that to? Do you know what I mean here?
Yes, I know what you mean. A couple of things. First of all, I think when we were at Robinson, everybody thought, well, we're in for a year and we're going to get out, so I'm not particularly interested in pursuing my military career and moving ahead. I'm just going to do my year and go back to civilian life. When the war started and we were out in San Francisco, we suddenly realized, well, we realized it on the 7th of December, we're in for the duration. So now there's an impetus and a rationale for saying, I'm going to be in the military for a while. I better consider this as my career activity for a period of time and look around. And the Army Air Corps was expanding like mad at the time. Everything was expanding like mad at that time. So there was a great effort by a number of people in Company B to get out of Company B and get into the Army Air Corps. There was also an effort, Bill Preston, who lives here in Emporia, he had worked on the Santa Fe Railroad. He got assigned to a railroad battalion. Vernon Fenner, the first sergeant that was pretty universally disliked, went to a military police unit. People began to cast about for something they could do. I remembered Don Ellen's claim that my commission was in my hip pocket. I didn't make any overt effort to go to officers' candidate school, but the exodus started. They denuded Company B of a lot of the non-coms to go to OCS. I went before a board at the Presidio and apparently passed because I'm at Benicia, and suddenly I get orders along with Bill Obley, who lived here in Emporia, and George Seitz, who lived in Allen, a good friend of mine, and we were ordered to go to Fort Benning, Georgia, to the Infantry Officers Candidate School for 3 weeks of training and become what they facetiously call 90-day wonders. You know, you're a lieutenant after 90 days of training for it. Of course, we had a lot more training. And so Obley and Seitz and I and a lot of other people from the 137th and the 134th, the Nebraska unit, which was out in California as well. The whole division was out there. And one of the two Missouri infantry regiments, we boarded troop trains in San Francisco, and a lot of us went to Benning. I don't know how many people were on that train. It was no small adventure. We got to Benning and started our training after this troop train ride across the country. Best troop train I was ever on. Pullman cars, nice meals in the dining car, well done by the military. We got to Benning in about mid-April, started our coursework on the 15th of April, and it was rigorous. Now here is the example of where the military training was top-notch. That infantry school knew what it was doing. That was the best training education I've ever had in my life.
Military or civilian?
Up to that point. No, up to that point.
Okay.
Military or civilian, absolutely. Up to that point. Up to that point, the best training I ever had in my life. Superior, exceedingly well done. It was stressful, it was strenuous, people washed out, but you worked hard. We were in what was called the Harmony Church area of Fort Benning, away from the main post, but we had excellent training, and we were mixed in not only with our class. We were class 32. We were supposed to be class 31, but for some reason they had so many people that we went into class 32. And our tactical commander, company commander, was a Captain Milligan. And later after the war, we had a small reunion in Omaha, Nebraska, and he came to that. And whether he was telling us the truth or not, I don't know, but he told us that class 32 was the best class that he ever ran through the infantry school. And he said the reason was because you'd all had a year's training in the experience, and you knew what was happening and what was going on. So I graduated from OCS after a strenuous time. I think I was sort of on the edge a little bit, maybe as an officer's candidate. I wasn't.
Do you think you had a troublesome go through Fort Benning?
I was told that I lacked force, that I didn't, and I asked the tactical officer, I said, well, what do you mean by force? And he didn't give me a very good explanation. There may be a bad word for it, but that was the word he used, and I didn't quite understand what it was. One of the clues was that if you were slipping a little bit, or on the edge or on the border, they would give you some added responsibility. And late in the sequence,
to see if you could handle it.
Right, exactly. And I was made the company commander, maybe sometime in the last month of training, where I had to move the company to all the classes and give all the orders and so forth and so on.
I take it you're kind of the chief student, in other words.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I made it and got through and got commissioned. And when we got our orders, all these infantry officers were assigned to two divisions, the 9th Armored Division, which is being activated at Fort Riley, and the 10th Armored Division, which was being activated at Fort Benning. And Obley and Seitz and I, the troika that had gone down from Company B together, were all assigned at Fort Riley, 65 miles about from Emporia, to the 9th Armored Division. We had 10 days leave, and the minute we got through with the graduation exercises on the 14th of July, we caught trains home. We caught the Columbus of Georgia, from Columbus, Georgia, over to Birmingham, and then we caught the L&N, the Louisville and Nashville, up to St. Louis, and then we caught the Missouri Pacific across the Missouri Pacific Eagle from Missouri to Kansas City, and finally the Santa Fe to Emporia. But I had an experience on maneuvers where we were guarding a bridge in West Monroe, Louisiana, and the company was pulled out very quickly on a Sunday afternoon, and 3 soldiers were missing. And as a sergeant, I was left behind to find these 3 soldiers.
This is going back to the Louisiana Maneuver?
Yeah, I'm going back to the Louisiana Maneuver for just quickly, then I'll jump back to Kansas City and what happened then. There's a relationship. So I'm left behind to try to find these 3 people. I don't locate anybody. So what do I do now? The company has moved out. I have no idea where they've gone. I don't know the direction that they left when they marched away. And it's dark, and I haven't found these 3 soldiers. And I'm not about to stay in West Monroe, Louisiana at night looking for 3 soldiers. So I just start out walking in the direction where I saw the company leave. And I'm walking along a highway, not having the slightest idea where I am going, having no idea where the company is, and cars are passing by, and I'm walking, trudging along, and suddenly an army vehicle goes by, and it stops. And it's a fellow from headquarters of the 1st Battalion, Holmgren was his name. And they see me walking, and they stop and pick me up. And Holmgren also was in the OCS class. So we graduated together. He was from Cottonwood Falls or Florence or Marion, somewhere out in that area. So we're coming home together on the train, and Holmgren says to me, I know 2 sisters in Kansas City that are working in Kansas City, and I want to stop by and have dinner and go dancing with them. Well, among my social graces is not dancing. I'm not a dancer. And I said, no, I want to go on. I don't care about meeting these 2 women. He said, no, he said, they're nice young ladies, and I know them well, and I've gotten in touch with them. I sent them a telegram, said that I'm coming by, and he said, I want you to stop with me, and we'll go out to dinner, and we will dance. And then he said we can go on the next day. So we get into Kansas City, and we are dirty. You know, we've been on this train for a couple of days. We look terrible. But here are these two nice-looking young women meeting us at the Union Station. So we all hop into a cab and go to the President Hotel, which later went down in disrepair and is now, I understand, come back to be a very fancy hotel. They sit in the lobby waiting for us. Norm Holmgren and I think that's his first name, went up into the, got a room and checked in and got cleaned up and got on some fresh uniforms and that sort of thing. Came back down. Sure enough, we went to dinner down in the plaza at some restaurant, and they had not only dinner, but they had the dance floor. So I sat there and talked to one of the girls while Holmgren is dancing with the other girl. To make what has already been a long story short, one of those two sisters turned out to be my wife. And there's more to that story, but we'll get around to that later. But we had our leave here at home, and we were assigned to Fort Riley, and we all went up to Riley to start to activate the 9th Armored Division. And infantry troops were coming in. They were still building barracks at Fort Riley. As a matter of fact, they had a contest up there at Riley during the time that we were there. This would have been 42, in the summer of 42, and they built a barracks in a day. From the concrete slab up, they put that barracks together in one day, just to see if they could do it, and they did. So we went through basic training again, a little bit different because it was armored infantry, and the armored infantry regiments were the name of the game at that time, but later they changed them to armored infantry battalions. They restructured the armored divisions considerably. But we went through basic again, and that went well. Our troops were all draftees, but they were good. We had a lot of old 137th officers in the unit, so there was that camaraderie that was holding us together. That was working well. And one of my friends, Bill Obley, decides to volunteer for Airborne. So Bill leaves the 9th Armored Division. I don't know what motivated Bill. Before Bill left, he married. He married a Junction City girl, Nadine Patterson. And she was a student here at Emporia State when we were here, but interrupted her schooling to marry Bill and follow him off around the circuitry while he was still in the service. So Bill and Nadine had gotten married. I was Bill's best man. Chaplain was Bill Gibble, who was later a famous chaplain to some degree for his work with the 9th Armored Division when they captured the Remagen Bridge. He was involved in that, and he was the chaplain that married Bill and Pat and Nadine. And Bill goes to Airborne. I continue at the 9th Armored. I'm an executive officer. I got promoted to first lieutenant after 6 months. That would have been in January of 43. And our training continues. We have motorcycles, we have tanks, we have vehicles. We're driving all over the roads out around Junction City, even off the post, doing exercises of various and sundry kinds, and just trying to do as much as we can. Now, an armored division doesn't work very well in the confines of Fort Riley, Kansas. That's not a great place to train an armored division. Later, they went out to the desert. I don't know that story because I
They still do, as a matter of fact.
Do they still go?
Yeah.
And so Obley had written me a couple of glowing letters about Airborne, and I believe I'll give that a shot. And so I volunteered for Airborne, and I talked to a couple of other officers who said they were interested. At that time, the physical examination for Airborne was pretty rigorous, and we went to the station hospital at Fort Riley and took a physical exam, and neither of the other two officers passed it, but I passed the physical exam. So in the spring of '43, I leave the 9th Armored Division and go to Fort Benning, back to Fort Benning, Georgia, now to what is called the frying pan area on the main post where the jump school conducts the jump school.
Now, before we do that, you, in our preliminary talk, you made a very interesting point that one of the reasons for leaving the 9th Armored was, and I think we used the term, it wasn't warish enough.
Yes. Yes, I think I said something like that.
In other words, it wasn't enough involved.
Here was the point. It was too close to home. It was a matter of proximity. Here you were in the service. You'd been out on the West Coast. You'd been down at Benning. You'd been in Little Rock. You'd been seeing the world. All of a sudden, you're stationed at Fort Riley, and almost every weekend you're getting on the MKMT, the Katy line, which run a little branch line from Junction City to Emporia to Parsons, where it joined the main line. You could get on a little bug-type electric or diesel-powered train of some sort that carried a few passengers and mail and some freight and that sort of thing. And you could buzz down from Junction City to Emporia on a Friday night, spend the weekend here on a 3-day pass, and then catch the train back up on Sunday evening and be ready for duty Monday morning. And I did that a lot. And at first it was great. We're back home. We're almost civilians again, at least on the weekend. That's what I wanted. I wanted to come back to Emporia. But after a while, you realized, hey, I'm stuck in this military situation, and spending the time on the weekends in Emporia is just sort of...
It's almost a distraction.
Yeah, right. It was a distraction, as a matter of fact, because you kept thinking about the good old days, and you kept thinking about what you wanted to happen in the future, and you probably weren't as attentive to your duties. I think that was one of the reasons that I left and volunteered for Airborne. And so I wanted to get, I decided, I had maybe 9 months from July to March or April, and that's when I went down to Benning. And I went through jump school. Jump school lasts for 4 weeks. First week is the washout week. They just work you so hard physically.
They want to get rid of you. If you can't take it, they want to get rid of you.
Exactly. They want to weed you out. So you survive that, and then the second week is training on a number of devices for landing, how to land a parachute, and you also start learning how to pack parachutes. And then the third week is on the towers, where they take you up on the 250-foot towers in controlled operations, and then they take you up and give you a free fall from 250 feet with an instructor on the ground yelling at you to communicating with you through a bullhorn to tell you to slip right or slip left or do this, that, and the other to make your landing. And then the fourth week is the jump week, where for 5 days you make 1 jump a day and make 5 qualifying jumps, and you're a paratrooper. I got through that okay. I didn't have any problems.
Did you think, was that training adequate?
Yes. Again, very effective.
Much good, like the OCS training.
The OCS training was good, and this was as good as, or better than the OCS training. They were on the ball. You had no doubt about what it was you were to do in that jump school. You were thoroughly schooled and well educated, well trained, well informed. You understood not only what you were doing, but why you were doing it, which is, to my mind, is essential to have a really good soldier.
You are preparing to go overseas.
Well, not right away.
Oh, okay.
Not really. I think the Army thought I was preparing to go overseas, but I didn't go overseas for quite some time. what happened was they were running people through the Airborne school, enlisted and officer personnel, at a maddening clip, just as they were running people through. They were graduating at 200 new second lieutenants down at Benning every day. 200 company graduated every day, just almost like an assembly line operation. What happened after I got through jump school was that the structuring of the airborne force was sort of in limbo. They didn't have places to put people, they didn't have bases for them, and they didn't have the right mix of officers and enlisted men. So after I went through jump school, they moved us from the main post of Benning across the Chattahoochee River into an area called the Alabama area. And that was a sort of a primitive tent-like camp. Mess halls were in barracks, but the rest of the camp was pretty tentatively set up. And they built us over there because they had a group of 300 or 400 officers that they couldn't make an assignment to. They had no place to put them.
You were in limbo, I think.
We were.
We
were exactly in limbo. Couldn't be a better word. And we couldn't go any place. There was no, except to go into Columbus, Georgia, and that wasn't, or Phoenix City, Alabama, which was even worse. You couldn't get to Atlanta very often, or Birmingham. Anyway, it was just, we were in limbo. We were just waiting for the Army to get itself structured. And they finally did. I finally got assigned to the 515th Parachute Infantry Regiment. And they had a cadre of enlisted personnel that they pulled out of the 507th.
Is that a regiment, 557th Regiment?
Right, that 515th Parachute Infantry was a regiment. That's right. And that formed up in the Alabama area, and so they began to get some structure. And eventually they moved us out of limbo to Camp McCall, North Carolina.
Bill, we're going to stop at that point because we are